Good morning, welcome to Writers in Conversation, a joint project between Brighton and Hove Libraries and New Writing South. My name's Julie and I work for the library service, and today I'm talking to local author William Shaw in Hangleton Library. Hello William.
Hello, good morning.
Morning, welcome. Welcome to Hangleton Library. I know you've been here before.
I have, several occasions, yeah.
So I'm going to start off by talking about how William became a writer, because William's done a lot of different and very interesting writing jobs in his career, as I've been researching. And William, you actually started off as a music journalist, I believe. I did.
I mean, I always wanted to be a writer and write books like I finally ended out writing. It just took me a long, sort of rather wiggly path to get there. But I graduated in the 1980s, and at that time, magazines, colour magazines, were suddenly cheap. And if you walked into W.H. Smith's, sort of in 1980, you'd see a small shelf. By 1983, it was an entire wall. And they desperately needed any idiot to write for those magazines. And I can remember literally walking into a magazine in just off Clerkenwell Road and saying, "Hi, I want to be a journalist. Can I write an article about the Smiths, please?" And the editor said, yes, you know, because they just wanted anybody. And like within a few weeks, I was sort of assistant editor of the magazine. I started writing for a small punk magazine, then I interviewed Neil Tennant, who was trying to get the Pet Shop Boys going. And he was, at the time, assistant editor of Smash Hits, and he desperately wanted to stop working for Smash Hits so he could get on with being a pop star. So he kind of needed journalists to go to Smash Hits so he could leave it. So I went to Smash Hits and I was there for several years when it was just like a very different, sort of strange and wonderful experience where you just sort of were paid, again, virtually nothing, flew around the world and interviewed very famous people. Yeah.
So you enabled the Pet Shop Boys, basically, to
their career is entirely down to me. Yeah.
Fabulous. So you did some other interesting things around non-fiction before you actually started writing fiction, didn't you? I've got down here. You did an oral history of travellers, a book about cults in Britain, and also Boys in the Hood about Los Angeles hip hop.
That's right.
Artists.
I got really interested because I was trying to write fiction. I was really interested in storytelling as a way of journalism, and you know, actually people like Neil Tennant were quite influential on that. He was very interested in that whole idea of American journalism, which was often much more, they called it narrative non-fiction there as a kind of style, and it wasn't very popular here, and the only way you could really do it was in book form. And I started off with, you know, just thinking, what's the subject? And in 91, I think it was, the Travellers, New Age Travellers became a huge issue, and I said, what if I go and hang out with them and just do an oral history of them? And a publisher said yes, and that was kind of my in to publishing. And then when I was writing music still, I worked a lot in America. I was working for an American magazine, and I interviewed a lot of hip-hop people like Tupac Shakur or Ice Cube or people like that, who were at the time it was really beginning to arrive, that kind of new, very narrative-based hip-hop, and I was really interested in it. So I went and lived in Los Angeles for about 18 months and spent my time in a place called South Central Los Angeles, which was where a lot of this music had been coming from, speaking to young men just about their lives, and young men who wanted to become hip-hop people. And it was, you know, for a sort of middle-aged, middle-class white guy who grew up in Devon, it was just like a very other world, you know, and people lived very hard lives. But, you know, they were incredibly welcoming of me. I was convinced they're just going to think I'm such a, you know, a weird geek, that they'd just be quite hostile to me. But actually, what they wanted was to tell their stories.
That actually, this leads brilliantly into what I was going to ask you about place generally. So well done, because I think you get a real sense of place from anything of yours that I've read, and I was particularly interested, obviously, because we're living in Brighton, that I discovered that you'd done a project in, I don't know if you can remember it now because it was in 2007, but this project here, which is, there's a book, 41 Places, 41 Stories, and you were commissioned by the Brighton Festival to do that, weren't you?
It was, I had this idea, I just had that, having done that project in Los Angeles and other things, that wherever you went, there was a story. And I used to do a column for the Observer magazine called The Small Lads, and it was based on the same thing. I spent ages trying to find a newspaper that would run this column, and they all said, oh, it's old hat, nobody wants that. And that was just literally calling people up about their classified adverts and just saying, what's the story behind you wanting to sell that, copy of an Archer's book was one of them, and you talk to these, and at first they were really sort of like, oh, well, there's not much of a story about that. And then after about 20 minutes, a story would always emerge, because when you're selling something, you're changing, and the essence of narrative is change. So you'd find out what the change was, and you'd get somewhere. And I kind of challenged myself to say, I believe on any street corner I can find somebody with an interesting story to tell. And it's not like, it doesn't have to be a huge story, but everybody has at some little point a story. I found an amazing designer called Richard Wallstrom, who lives actually just very close to here. Oh. And he worked with a Lewis company called Standard 8. And they said, well, we're not just going to put these on a bit of vinyl, we're going to make things that tell the story. So I spent about 3 months frantically running around, because we had a festival deadline to hit, finding all these stories, writing them up. They're very short little stories, and then these wonderful people installed them in place. Like there was a deck chair on the pier, on the Brighton pier, with a story on it, and it was printed onto the deck chair. There was the toilets in Pavilion Gardens had stories written on all around the walls. The number 7 bus had a story on it, which was the hardest one to find, because you had to catch all the number 7 buses to find the one with the story. That might have been a mistake putting that one on that one. But people, what I didn't realise, people turned it into a kind of treasure hunt to find all the 41 stories. And then once we'd done it, I decided to publish a book of it, of just the stories, and it was a lot of fun. Yeah,
it was so interesting to read it, because it really does capture that concept of mass observation as well, doesn't it? Which I'm really interested in. That you've got a portrait of, like, I don't know, a certain period of time with ordinary people doing ordinary things, and it kind of captures that moment. And I find that really interesting.
I was at Sussex University, and the Mass Observation Archive was there. And if you don't know about this thing, it was a thing that started, really got big in the war, of just recording ordinary people, asking people to write diaries and just recording them in the idea. And it was actually almost surrealist. It started as a surrealist art movement, funnily enough. Yeah. The idea that if you take people's stories, you get that kind of surreality of normal life. And that's kind of what I wanted. I've gone off on a bit of one there, but I love the Mass Observation Archive. And
so after all these experiences, you finally became a writer of crime fiction. Yeah. So what, I mean, you started off with your Breen and Tozer series. So can I ask you, is this true? Is Helen Tozer the mother of Alex Cupidi in the second series?
That was always, when I wrote a book called The Bird. I'd written these 3 books based in London in the 1960s, and when I decided to do something that was again location based in Dungeness, I began writing a policewoman character. She wasn't even the main character in the book, but I was wondering, who is this woman? And I thought, what if she is Helen Tozer from my first series' daughter? In that case, I know exactly who she is, and I know why she's a bit spiky. And so it just made sense to me, but I didn't need to tell anybody that. But then a couple of books in, I thought, oh, okay, maybe it'd be quite fun to make the connection clear that it is. But for me, it was just like a way of characterisation. I knew who she was because I knew who her mum was.
Because of course Helen appears, doesn't she, in the Cupidi
and it's
series.
Just as difficult in modern days. It's slightly more so than she, but just as tricky as she is in the 1960s.
I'm also interested in talking still about place. Is Dungeness. Right. I mean, you seem to know Dungeness really well, and in the books it's like a character almost in the Alex Cupidi series, and it really it does really give an atmosphere with the, you know, the power station and the marshes and the sort of the bleakness. It's, you know, there's a sort of otherworldliness to it, I think. And I just wondered, you know, why Dungeness, really?
All sorts of reasons. I mean, it is a fabulous place. If you've never been there, it's like 12 square miles of shingle that literally just forces itself out into the channel, and it's just strange because, you know, there's nowhere else in Britain like it. It's the largest shingle bank in the world. Oh. And it's sort of this collection of, like you say, old railway carriages and things like that, where old quarry workers have gradually sort of started to live, and now it's this, you know, obviously the artist Derek Jarman lived there, and that sort of brought an artsy sort of community, and now lots of millionaires have turned up, turning their things into these wonderful, sleek, modern creations that look a bit strange compared to some of the other tumble-down things. And so you've got all this sort of very rich people, local people, and a nuclear power station. Having written that urban thing, I wanted to write something rural, but not you know, hedgerows and country cottages rural. And I think it's really interesting for that because it's really quite extreme nature there. And it's one of the, you know, naturalists love it because it's an extraordinary environment. It's like there's more bee species there than anywhere else in Britain. It's one of the great places for migrating birds, and all that post-war birder community. That was one of the first places that was kind of theirs. You know, all these when birding stopped being a thing that vicars did, and you know, and actually ordinary British people started getting interested in natural history. Dungeness was one of the places, you know, Norfolk and Dungeness was where they went to, and they met each other and they sort of formed these things. And there's still a great bird observatory, which is sort of run just by birders there, as well as it's the first RSPB nature reserve. And, you know, we live in times when nature's quite important, I think. You know, I think it's quite a big... It's nice to be able to sneak it into a crime fiction book because we've got a ticking clock really about nature, and I kind of wanted something I could create that sense of, you know, you can turn that in, you know, crime fiction is all about tension and creating tension and danger, and I think by putting the natural history in there you have a subtle sense there's a kind of permanent danger in our world now that's also part of the narrative, and it also gives me an excuse to find out about stuff. Well,
I was going to ask you, obviously there's a lot of research that goes into your books because you do cover, you know, a massive amount of ground, because, you know, they're more than a whodunit, definitely, and they cover lots of topical issues. And environmentalism came into Gravesend, for example, didn't it, with the badger community and the housing developments that were planned. And I must say, I found the badger bit absolutely fascinating. So you had the story going on above ground, but then you also had an old badger as a character tunnelling below the ground, and you kind of brought, you know, you kind of went from one to the other and brought them together, and that...
There's not many crime fiction books narrated by a badger, are there?
No, definitely not. No, I wondered how that idea had come to you.
I didn't intend to do it, and I was about 2/3 of the way through it, and I thought, actually, that's a really good perspective for crime fiction, because badgers can only say, you know, what you try and do. And it's a real, you know, it's a trick. You try and withhold stuff from the reader, or withhold stuff from the detective. And so a badger's a really good narrator, because the badger can see stuff that it doesn't care or know what it is, really. And it's in another world underground. And so the reader knows, but the detectives don't. And I love that sort of sense of what you can do.
And also, I mean, the issues you cover, I mean, I started listing them and I kind of gave up in a way, because through the whole Alex Cupidi series, I mean, you've covered, for example, migrant workers and gang masters and stateless people living, you know, really, as you called them, ghosts with no legal status anywhere, no passport, no right to remain. I mean, there's, you know, financial scams, historic child abuse. I mean, you've covered everything, William.
I think one of the interesting challenges you've got as a crime writer is you've got to, you know, you've got to convince people that a murder's happened. And we live in, actually, despite what you read in the papers, actually quite a safe society. And they don't happen very often. And yet they happen a lot in our books, you know. So our job is actually to convince you that kind of weird stuff can exist, because we've got to scare you. Do you know what I mean? You've got to convince you there's danger in these books. And writers take all sort of pathways, but the one I quite like is like, when I moved to Brighton, I moved back to Brighton in 2000, I joined a writers group, and one of the other writers in it is CJ Sansom. Right. And he was writing Dissolution at the same time as we were in this writers group. And I really understood through working with him, you know, if you read his first book was a book called Dissolution. And the first bit is just like this slow passage into London where his main character comes into London on a horse, and it's just what he sees. But you know everything he sees is historically true because it's just so well presented. You kind of think, oh, that's true. Once you convince somebody that world is true, you can kill people in it. Right, and in a weird way, that I like to be able to explore that sort of political and natural history world, because A, it's really good for me and it challenges me to find stuff out. But also, if the reader believes it's true, then I can kill people. And I think that's the thing, is it's a really interesting form, crime fiction, because I think one of the reasons why it's so successful is because it contains this weird mix of fiction and non-fiction. If you have that realist crime, that's your task, is to make people believe in it.
And I mean, also the police sort of procedural stuff and that kind of thing. I mean, have you done a lot of work on making sure that the police details are accurate? Or
there's a guy who I saw the last Friday, actually, Graham. And Graham Bartlett used to be, I forget his rank, chief superintendent in Brighton, and he was in charge of Brighton police. And he's one of Peter James's kind of advisors and things like that. And he's on the writing scene because he also writes fiction. But he always said, William, if you need any help, or it's more like, William, you need help. Come and talk to me about it. And he's lovely because he, there's a book I wrote called Salt Lane, that one. Yep. And in it there's a siege at a farmhouse. And this is just one of the many things he does. And it was really interesting because he said, and I started off with a shotgun as the siege weapon. And he said, oh, William, don't do that, don't do that. Because a shotgun siege is really boring, dramatically, because you want a conversation to go on at this thing. It's not going to happen because everybody that you have in that is not an armed police officer. They've got to move back half a mile. Make it a knife. Make it a knife, William. And he's got a really good story sense, but also a sense of how you can convince people that you're working within a real police environment, because it's a really interesting pact between the reader and the writer, really, about what goes on in police procedurals. Because, you know, in our books, 2 or 3 people will solve a crime. In real life, 20 or 30 people who might not even be in the same room together ever solve a crime. And the person who discovers the body is not the person who puts the hand on the shoulder of the criminal. You know, they are completely different bits of it. If you know anybody involved in the community who's involved in the crime, you have to withdraw yourself, which cuts out 99% of all crime books. So you have to kind of convince people of workarounds. When I was writing on The Birdwatcher, my main character's best friend is killed. And he said, well, that can't actually happen, but I can make it happen. And he found me a little workaround that made it plausible that for a couple of weeks they could need this guy on the case. And it's things like that, because they only make the story better. Right at the beginning, the first book I wrote Helen Tozer, the woman we talked about earlier. She was a driver for my main character and dashing around in a little police mini, kind of stuff like that. I found 2 women who had served in 1968 in D Division in Marylebone at the time, and one of them had actually worked as a probationer on CID. And I just got a contract for this book, so it was written. And I said, can I just check a few facts with you? And I was very full of myself because I'd got a book and I'd got a contract. And the first thing said, well, that couldn't have happened. Women weren't allowed to drive police cars in 1968. And I thought, oh no. But actually, when I rewrote it, where she does drive a car, but she's not allowed to, actually it's a better book. And you believe in it because you kind of think, the reader thinks, why? Women weren't allowed to drive. You know, you're kind of invested at that point.
One of the things I was also interested in is why you chose women for your main characters. Because certainly obviously Alex Cupidi is the kind of the main character, but then you've got her daughter Zoe, you've got her mother, as we've mentioned, Helen, her colleague and friend Jill Ferriter. And there's not actually, although there obviously are men in the books. I mean, Bill Smith, who's Alex's neighbour and a former police officer, is kind of the main male character that reappears, but you don't explore so much the male viewpoint, approach. It's much more focused on the females.
That's true, isn't it? Yeah. I did start, my first main character was a man, and I'd written 3 books on that, and I thought I've got to trick myself in this, because it's easy to write a man who's a bit like you. The moment you're writing outside your gender, you have to think a bit harder, and so it was literally just like, if I'm writing a woman, I've got to, you know, she's not necessarily going to think the same way as I think or do the same things as I think, and I found that really useful. And I was quite apprehensive about it at the beginning, and I talked to the writer Ellie Griffiths, I'm really good friends with, another Leslie Thompson. I was doing an event with them, and I said, I'm not sure I can do this. And they said, of course you can, because you write other secondary character women, all right, but what you need to do is make sure that you get the scenes when women are alone together, right? So, and that's,
I think the relationships between the, you know, mother, daughter and Alex, you know, the 3 generations of women who are all a bit, I don't know, unconventional, shall we say, maybe a bit spiky, a bit, you know, I find that really realistic.
I think they clearly love each other and are very codependent, but they're also very different people. And I love writing the teenager because, you know, teenagers are just great for, just practically, because they can do things they're not supposed to. They don't quite understand the world in the same way. They're incredibly idealist. And it's really useful to have that. And you know, my main character, Alex, likes the world around her, likes to understand the world around her, and her teenager is incomprehensible, which I think is something that anybody who's got a teenager kind of understands. And what I'm really, you know, in my last book that I finished, and actually the next one I'm starting, Zoe's still 17, and I want to keep her at 17. But the whole thing about crime fiction is, modern crime fiction has to be realist, and people do get older and they have chunks taken out of her. So she's got to be 18, she's got to leave home soon or something. And it's like, oh no, what do I do? But she's such fun to write.
Oh, brilliant. Well, what I wanted to end up with really was obviously your latest book. We have here in Pride of Place, the Trawler Man, which has only come out very, very recently. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about your latest book?
It started with this idea about, if you're lost at sea, you can't be, you know, you can't be declared dead. It takes 7 years for that to happen if they don't find your body. And there was actually somebody or other who runs one of the arches down the seafront told me a story of something that happened in her life quite a long time ago, exactly that you know, this, her husband had been lost at sea and she almost couldn't move on while that was going on. And then I was just at Dungeness and I saw the train coming in and I just thought, what if it's a wedding on that train? And started from there, and this idea there. And out of that, I kind of thought, lost at sea, I've got to write about trawlers, which is a big bit of politics now on the coast, isn't it? You know, and through another crime writer, I found a lovely trawlerman based in Theakston. And he agreed to take me out on his boat and stuff like that, just so I could get that kind of detail right. And it's, you know, it's an extraordinary world, that bit of coast. And I love that bit of Kent coast. It's really dramatic.
Have you ever written a book in a library? Because I know some of the other authors we've spoken to do their writing in libraries. Is that something you've ever done?
When I was in London, I was trying to become a writer. I would escape to the local library there to do it, and then because I went to there were these writing classes run in the library. So I'd do my homework in the library before the writing classes. I like the randomness of libraries. You don't know what you're going to get. You're not being sold anything. So I think it's really useful every now and again to go into. I mean, I was used to use the Central Library in Brighton, which was just such a brilliant thing when it was built there. And
Jubilee.
Yeah, Jubilee Library, and just you know, because you pick up odd books, don't you? And I think that's the real pleasure. I also volunteer and take books around at for Brighton Libraries, because it just seemed like I was doing a talk in Cambridge, and I met this librarian, and that was her job. She was the sort of libraries at home coordinator, and I just thought that's such a sensible thing to do. I'd never heard of it, so I called up Brighton Libraries and said, "Do you do something similar here?"
So, well, I'm really glad you did, because you've been absolutely invaluable to us during this last year, when obviously more people than normal couldn't get out and about, and libraries have been closed at various times, and you know, we've had a wonderful band of volunteers who have made sure that people have got their reading material to hopefully keep them sane. And I believe some of our clients have been reading your books, not necessarily chosen for them by you, I might add, but I believe...
I could do that, couldn't I? I could start, oh look, here's a book, here's a bag of books.
Yes, I believe we have been introducing some of our clients to your books.
I'm so grateful, thank you.
So yeah, I just wanted to say also just a really big thank you to you for helping us with that, because it's been really just fabulous, and the difference it's made to people's lives. You know, reading is a real lifeline, isn't it? So
it is.
No, that's just been fantastic.
Well, it gets me out of the house as well. I'm not at home all the time.
So yeah, William, it's been a pleasure. What can I say? I mean, please, you know, please carry on volunteering, and your books are obviously available for people to borrow from Brighton and Hove libraries and from, you know, good bookshops or online retailers or what have you, but do give them a try, because it's really worth your time. So thank you again, William, very much.
Pleasure. Lovely to be here.